Hello and welcome back to another breaking news update. My name is Jimmy Boyd and you are watching Boyd News. I want to thank you so much for tuning in today. I have some breaking news coming out for you. We have a phone call that was supposedly leaked by the Russians. Okay, this was a phone call between German officers, okay, the German military, top generals that were having a phone call, and supposedly they were leaking some very sensitive information here. They didn't realize their phone call was tapped into, and it was. And this information got recorded and sent to a major Russian state TV news outlet. And this information is just starting to come out now. So during this phone call, this general right here, his name is Lieutenant General Ingo Gerhartz, and he was supposedly talking with other German generals. And during this phone call, they were discussing these British Storm Shadow missiles that are in Ukraine, and they supposedly leaked some information saying that they have a few people on the ground firing these missiles. So all these British Storm Shadow missiles that have been used, when it targeted, I think it targeted the Kerch Bridge at one point, it targeted Crimea, lots of deep behind enemy lines targets of Russian troops, these have been used for. And supposedly he leaked during this call that they really are being used by the British inside Ukraine, meaning British troops are on the ground in Ukraine. So obviously that's really bad, right? Because Britain is part of NATO. So that means NATO is actively fighting against the Russians, okay? And also during this phone call, they were discussing this Taurus missile, this cruise missile that has very high capabilities that they've been deciding whether to send to Ukraine, supposedly is going to require German troops on the ground in Ukraine. So I put out a video a few days ago of German Chancellor Olaf Scholz. He came out and said, no, we can't send these to Ukraine because it would require German troops on the ground to fire them. And then he also kind of leaked as well that British troops were on the ground as well as French troops, supposedly. So we've got multiple people coming out and confirming that there's for sure at least British troops on the ground, maybe even French troops on the ground, firing these missiles at Russian targets behind enemy lines. So this is really huge here, because if this is true, if this somehow comes out to be true, we know for sure that NATO is actively involved in this war, not just sending weapons to Ukraine, but actually actively fighting the Russians and launching missiles at them. Okay, so this is huge, huge news right here. Very dangerous what's going on. And we had Boris Pistorius, the German defense minister, coming out in the last 24 hours and trying to shut down this narrative and deflect and make it seem like this is not real, that the Russians are actively involved in an information war right now, that they're fabricating all of this, that this really isn't real. So let me show you this clip here. I'm going to kind of read it for you because it's in German. But let's take a look at this real quick. The whole thing is choreographed. A few hours after this clip was published by none other than one of Vladimir Putin's chief propagandists, this message appeared. It is highly unlikely that they will react so quickly, so it was certainly coordinated and choreographed. And should the fairy tale, should the legend strengthen, we would then work on a war against Russia, which is completely absurd because we only have one intention, namely to support Ukraine in its justified defense against Russia. Okay, so if you notice, he says here at the end, he says, and should the fairy tale, should the legend strengthen, we would then work on a war against Russia, which is completely absurd. So he's saying here that this phone call that's not real, if it happens to become real because the Russians make it real in a way, right? They push for this and it really becomes a real thing, even though according to him it's not. That this would prove that also the Germans are actively planning to go to war with Russia. Okay, because during this phone call as well, this lieutenant general was talking about these Taurus missiles and saying, yeah, I think we'll go ahead and start sending these to Ukraine. But yet Olaf Scholz, just the other day, that's why I was talking about that other video that I put out about the German Chancellor Olaf Scholz. He just said a few days ago that they had no plans to send these to Ukraine because it requires German troops to be on the ground to fire them. So this lieutenant general on your screen here said the opposite. He said, we're basically going to go ahead and start planning to send these to Ukraine. So that means that Germans are actively preparing to fight Russia, if that makes sense. Okay? So I have an article here too that goes in a little bit more detail to this conversation, some of the things they were talking about. So this is on The Independent. Germany leak of UK military tactics in Ukraine is a security breach worrying on many levels, says MP. Zoom in a little bit. The leak of a conversation revealing Britain's activities on the ground in Ukraine is a security breach that is worrying on a number of levels, a prominent conservative MP has said. British soldiers are on the ground in Ukraine helping Kiev's forces fire long-range Storm Shadow missiles, according to the leak in Russian media of a top-secret call involving German Air Force officers. Authenticated by Berlin, during the conversation, Lieutenant General Ingo Gerhardt, the head of German Air Force, describes how the UK and Ukraine works to deploy Storm Shadow missiles against targets behind Russian lines. So again, this phone call that was supposedly so top secret, it got tapped into by the Russians. They were able to gain this information and leak it to the public. When it comes to mission planning, the German commander says, I know how the English do it. They do it completely in reach back. They also have a few people on the ground. They do that. The French don't. So he said here, I know how the English do it. Okay. They have a few people on the ground. So he's talking about Ukraine. He's saying that British troops are on the ground in Ukraine firing these Storm Shadow missiles. So building up the idea that if they send these Taurus missiles, which are German-owned, to Ukraine, Germany will have to fire these themselves, not the Ukrainians. Berlin has launched an investigation. Germany's defense minister Boris Pistorius has described the leak of the conversation as part of Russia's information war against the West and said it is about undermining our resolve. On Monday, the German government sought to contain the domestic fallout from the leak and promised a quick investigation into how it was possible that a conversation by top German military personnel could be intercepted and published. Several German media have reported that the officers were in a meeting on the WebEx platform when they were taped. A spokesman for the German Defense Ministry told Germany's Bild newspaper. There are indications that an insufficiently secure means of communication was used in view of the content that was obviously discussed. This is, among other things, a subject of further investigation. So my question is, why, if these are generals, how do they know not to use, in a form of communication that can be easily tapped into? Like, wouldn't you want to use a secured line? Obviously, they were not, according to this, okay? It is absolutely clear that such claims that this conversation would prove that Germany is preparing for war against Russia. Yes, that would prove that this is absurdly infamous Russian propaganda. A spokesman for German Chancellor Olaf Scholz told reports in Berlin. Government spokesman Wolfgang Buchner said the leak was part of Russia's information war against the West and that the aim was to create discord with Germany. The audio was posted to social media by Margarita Simonian, the head of the Kremlin-controlled Russia Today channel, who claimed it was proof that Germany had been planning attacks on Crimea. On the call, 4 officers can be heard discussing deployment scenarios for Taurus missiles in Ukraine ahead of a meeting with the country's defense minister, Boris Pistorius. Germany news agency DPA reported. The officer then states that early delivery and rapid deployment of Taurus long-range cruise missiles would only be possible with the participation of German soldiers, just like I was talking about before, and that training Ukrainian soldiers to deploy the Taurus on their own would be possible but would take months. They obviously don't have time for that right now. The recording also shows the German government has not given its okay for the delivery of the cruise missiles sought by Ukraine, DPA reported. There has been a debate in Germany on whether to supply the missiles to Ukraine as Kyiv faces battlefield setbacks, and while military aid from the United States is held up in Congress. Germany is now the second biggest supplier of military aid to Ukraine after the U.S. and is further stepping up its support this year. So, obviously, this is very big news here. And if this is true, this could be proof that Germany is actively involved in participating in this war very soon. Okay. And what I'm honestly more concerned of is the fact that there's already supposedly British troops on the ground in Ukraine. If if Russia can somehow prove that, this could be really bad news because that means that NATO troops are on the ground in Ukraine, which I'm sure a lot of people probably have already been speculating as well that there was a big potential and possibility that there was already NATO troops for a very long time now, maybe from the very beginning of the war. But it's crazy that, think about these Storm Shadow missiles. These have been used for quite some time now, for like what, the last year or so. And they've taken out multiple targets inside of Russia, Crimea. All right. And if these are really being fired by British troops, this is really bad news. Okay. So we'll have to see what comes out from this. I'm sure more information is coming out. Is this really a disinformation campaign from the Russians to try to derail this and make the West appear as if they're involved here, but maybe they're really not? Or is the West really involved? Let me know what you think down below. But that's going to be it from this story. Again, when more information comes out, I will update you. I'll keep an eye on this and see what happens from here. But I'm sure we're going to have some major information coming out here in the next probably couple days. So if you got anything out of this, please hit the like button on this video. And if you enjoy my content, please consider subscribing to the channel. Hit the notification bell. That way YouTube can notify you. And with that, I hope you all have a great day. Everybody take care and God bless. And we'll see you in the next one.